A voice that does not simply influence decisions, but reshapes beliefs, redirects worship, and changes the course of a kingdom. This is the story of Jezebel, a queen whose ambition was powerful, whose influence was undeniable, and whose legacy became a warning about what happens when power loses its restraint. Long ago, the kingdom of Israel stood at a crossroads. Outwardly, it looked like a nation with a throne, a king, and stability. But inside the palace, something was deeply unstable. King Ahab sat on the throne, but he was not a strong ruler. He was easily influenced, easily shaken, and easily guided by fear rather than conviction. Into this fragile leadership stepped Jezebel, a princess from a foreign land, strong-willed, uncompromising, and determined to reshape Israel according to her beliefs. From the moment she became queen, the atmosphere of the kingdom began to change, not slowly, but steadily. Like a shadow spreading across a bright land. Jezebel brought with her the worship of Baal, a religion that stood in direct opposition to the God of Israel. And she did not introduce it quietly. She promoted it boldly. She built temples, supported prophets of Baal, and used royal influence to make her beliefs the center of the kingdom. Ahab did not resist her. In fact, he followed her lead. And in doing so, he opened the door for widespread spiritual and moral collapse. Soon, the kingdom that once belonged to truth began drifting into deception. The voices of prophets who spoke for God were silenced. Not by silence alone, but by fear. Jezebel ordered the persecution of God's prophets. Many were forced into hiding. Some were killed. Others fled into caves and remote places just to survive. Truth became dangerous, and speaking it came with a price. But in the middle of this darkness, one voice refused to disappear. Elijah, a prophet who stood firm even when standing alone. Elijah did not seek power. He did not chase approval. He simply spoke what he believed was true. And that truth brought him directly into conflict with King Ahab and Jezebel's influence. One day, Elijah confronted Ahab with a bold message. A challenge not just to the king, but to the entire system of false worship that had taken over the land. And so the stage was set for one of the most dramatic moments in Israel's history: Mount Carmel. 2 altars were prepared, one for the prophets of Baal, one for the God of Israel. The challenge was simple. The God who answered by fire would reveal the truth. The prophets of Baal went first. They prayed. They shouted. They called out for hours. They danced. They cried louder and louder. But nothing happened. No fire. No answer. No response. Only silence. Elijah watched calmly, not with arrogance, but with certainty. Then it was his turn. He rebuilt the altar of God. He soaked it with water until it seemed impossible for anything to ignite it. And then he prayed. A simple prayer. No shouting, no performance, just faith. And in a moment that changed everything, fire fell from heaven. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water around it. Everything. The truth was no longer hidden. It was revealed with power. The people fell to their knees in awe. But while many hearts turned back to truth that day, one heart only grew harder. Jezebel. When she heard what happened on Mount Carmel, she was not moved. She was not humbled. She was enraged. Instead of accepting the truth revealed before an entire nation, she doubled down on her pursuit of Elijah. A message was sent. A threat was delivered. Elijah's life was now in danger.
And for the first time, the man of courage ran. Not because he stopped believing, but because even faith-filled people can feel the weight of fear. Elijah fled into the wilderness, tired, broken, wondering if he was alone. But even there, his story was not over, because truth is never defeated by pressure, and justice is never forgotten. Back in the palace, Jezebel continued to rule with influence and intimidation. But something had already shifted. Power built on corruption is never as stable as it appears. And slowly, the foundations beneath her began to crack. Time passed, and the consequences of injustice began to rise. The kingdom that had once turned away from truth now began to face the cost of that decision. Division, unrest, and judgment. Jezebel's influence, once feared and unchallenged, began to weaken. The very power she used to control others could no longer protect her from what was coming. And eventually, her story reached its final chapter. A moment marked not by celebration, but by consequence. Jezebel met her end not surrounded by power, but by collapse. The queen who once commanded fear was...
Her legacy was no longer control. It was a warning. A reminder that influence without integrity does not last, and that power without truth eventually falls. But the story does not end in darkness, because this story was never only about a queen. It was about a battle between two ways of living: faith and falsehood, truth and deception, courage and intimidation, justice and corruption. Elijah stood for truth, even when he stood alone. Jezebel chose power, even when it cost everything around her. And their contrast remains a lesson that still speaks today. Because influence is powerful. It can build or destroy. It can protect truth or distort it. And every generation must decide what kind of influence it will follow. The story of Jezebel is not just history. It is a warning and a reflection. That unchecked power leads to destruction. That corruption always leaves consequences. That truth may be challenged, but it is never erased. And that courage is not measured by how many stand with you, but by whether you stand for what is right when no one else will. That is the story of Jezebel. A story of power, a story of corruption, and a story of judgment that reminds us truth always has the final word.